Good day, my friends. Last week at our prayer gathering on Wednesday, we were reflecting on 2020. We're thinking about the top 5 prayer requests we had actually as a church, as a body of believers for the year, and how amazing it was that God answered those prayers in the midst of a pandemic situation. When we made those prayer requests, when we thought about what we should pray for, we'd ask God, what would you have us pray for in 2020? We came up with this list and we published it and shared it in many different ways long before we knew there was going to be a pandemic. And yet God was faithful. In spite of what was going on in the world, He answered our prayers. And I believe He did that because we didn't cease to gather together and pray for those things that were on our hearts and minds. We gathered on Sunday mornings, whether it was online or in person. We gathered throughout the week in various prayer gatherings, including our midweek prayer gathering on Wednesday nights at 6:30. And we made it a priority to continually pray together for the work and the mission of God's church here in Albert County. And God was faithful. I can't say that too many times. God was faithful in the midst of this situation to do something we couldn't even imagine. And last week, especially as we shared together, as we encouraged one another with those answered prayers, and as we entered into our time of prayer together, what was so exciting to me is we were completely online. This was still last week in the orange phase. Even though we were all completely online, there was a powerful sense of God's presence and His Holy Spirit as we gathered together on Zoom, as we looked at each other through our screens. Nevertheless, God still worked and was present and did an amazing thing to encourage us, so much so, frankly, that our time went long and folks were saying, hey, we don't want to leave. This is too good a moment, too good an experience of God, as we came together, as we gathered with this online tool. Now, I don't know about you, now that we're back in red, but there's a temptation to think, oh great, things are even worse again, and this is even harder again. And yes, there's some more changes. Yes, there's some more restrictions. But what I want to encourage you with today is the reminder that we can still gather. Whether it's like this, where you're watching and hearing my voice through your TV or your computer or your tablet or device, or gathering through something like Zoom, where it's live and interactive. My friends, this is still God's people coming together and sharing together and having the opportunity to hear His voice in the midst of a very difficult season. Now, don't make any mistake. I prefer to be face-to-face with people as well. I much prefer, especially when it comes to prayer times and gatherings, to have the chance to see each other and to hear each other's tone of voice a little more clearly, and to see each other's body language, and to be able to see one another in a tangible and real way, unlike on the screen. But as the old saying goes, desperate times call for desperate measures. And I want to encourage you that in these desperate times, in these difficult times, that we can still do something that the Bible's commanded us to do, which is to gather. And as we long for healing, as we long for change, let's not forget to gather together in prayer and to learn to hear God together in prayer. In 2 Chronicles 7:14, we've mentioned that a number of times over this last year. It says that if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sins and I will heal their land. That's what God promises to do. And it's so easy for us to miss this, that passage is a corporate passage. It's one for God's people together to do. Something that we don't just do one person at a time, but we do as God's people, as the church. Gathering has always been critical to who we are as the church. And I know for some of you are saying it's not the same gathering online. I agree, it's not the same, but that doesn't mean it doesn't count. And that doesn't mean it doesn't work. In fact, last Wednesday's prayer meeting and many of our Sunday mornings as we've gathered prove that God is still working even through this new and, for many of us, unusual way of gathering as God's church. You see, throughout the Bible, God has commanded His people to gather and to find ways to gather. Throughout history, when persecution came, the church found new and innovative ways to gather. Sometimes they had to hide in a catacomb. Sometimes they had to meet in the woods, deep in the woods, so nobody would know they were there, so they wouldn't be arrested or thrown in prison or even killed for gathering. But nevertheless, they found a way to gather. My friends, we still need to gather today. I love how the prophet Joel says it. In Joel chapter 1, verse 14, he says this, calls us to this, the people of God. He says, consecrate a fast, call a solemn assembly, gather the elders and all the inhabitants of the land to the house of the Lord your God, and cry out to the Lord. You know, in the Old Testament, to gather in the house of the Lord meant the temple, meant going to this physical location. But the New Testament tells us that all believers receive God's Holy Spirit when they put their faith in Jesus Christ, and that we are the temple of God. That means whenever God's people gather, however we gather, that's the house of God. The house of God can be a Zoom meeting. The house of God can be a Facebook Live. The house of God can take many formats that we never considered before we had this technology. Because the house of God is wherever the people of God come together, however they do, and call on Him. Let me encourage you in these days to once again consecrate yourselves. Perhaps even to consecrate a fast, to fast and to pray in this season, so that we can call on the Lord our God and know that He's going to hear, to gather with us as we gather in our various prayer gatherings and Sunday morning gathering, even in this red phase, even if we go into total lockdown, which we're all praying won't happen. But know that no matter what, we can still gather, and God can still move, and God is still faithful, and God still answers our prayers. Because at the end of the day, what I know for sure is this: God is not only faithful, He is still in control, He's still on His throne, and He's still answering our prayers. And that, my friends, is one of the best reasons for us to gather, so we can see and hear God answer our prayers as we move forward together. And that, I'm sure, you will find, as I do, is good news. Have a great day, my friends.